Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. The US military has recognised climate change as a national security threat for decades. Our guest today, Sherri Goodman, has been credited with educating a generation of US military officers and government officials about the complex interactions between climate change and national security. She is Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security and the author of Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership and the Fight for Global Security.
The story of Threat Multiplier and the book is the story of the military's environmental and climate awakening over the last 30 years, both as I've lived it and as the stories of other military leaders on the front lines of a changing climate as it's been experienced around the world and here at home in the United States.
Climate change undermines stability.
In many places around the world now, we see these risks of climate change exacerbating the security situation, and it's all about stability. So, in security, we're always trying to enhance and improve stability, but now we have an unstable natural system. It's been disrupted by climate change.
Food security is a key priority.
We've seen now an increasing intersection between food and agricultural and kind of climate and security in general. We have a whole project at the Center for Climate Security, of which I'm a part, about feeding resilience and what we need to do to improve food security globally, and that we need to understand that as part of a broader basis of human and global security. As we think about how we're going to have secure communities in the future, we have to provide for that agricultural resilience.
Empowering women and girls is critical for improving food security.
Often I will say that it's empowering the women and girls to be more active in setting the basis for food and water security in their local community that provides that modicum of stability for people to thrive. I've seen that with my own eyes when I've been in parts of the Middle East and parts of Africa, that just enabling the women and girls to be more central to making those decisions allows for greater security and long-term stability in the region.
The combination of climate change and poor governance should not be underestimated.
In many of these countries across Middle East and North Africa, from Somalia to Mali and Niger, have just exploding population rates, fragile governance, and then, as we say, climate change makes them a petri dish for terrorism.
We need collaboration and persistence.
The U.S. and other allied nations and partners are working on, let's say, on the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, which is a set of integrated solutions that provide both infrastructure and food and water security. These things unfortunately don't happen overnight, and there's a lot of tensions in the region. But, that is a basis in many ways of thinking through these long-term solutions that provide an understanding of what it takes to be resilient as a society. And as you say, it's both food, water, energy, and also economic empowerment for women and girls, because that also changes over the long term what the birth rates are, and then enables the society to be more sustainable.
Education is critical.
In the U.S. Department of Defense today, and across many of our NATO allies, there are efforts now to have climate literacy within our military forces. And that means understanding, having climate relevant education and training at various echelons and levels of command.
Change takes time.
Many of them started out as skeptics. They thought, okay, climate change, that's for environmentalists, or that's for tree huggers, and we're warfighters. On the other hand, military leaders and military in general are trained to make decisions based on evidence, based on the evidence and based on the science. So they looked at that evidence. We spent a year with the nation's leading climate scientists in the UK and in the US, and with national security and intelligence professionals. And then they could see that those risks of warming temperatures, retreating sea ice, prolonged drought, sea level rise, storm surge, flooding, all of those risks were going to have security implications.
Food, water, and energy resilience are essential.
Well, to have stability in the climate era, we need mutually assured resilience, or some call it collective resilience. And I think we're moving towards this concept of collective resilience where food, water, and energy security at the local level are an essential component of having global security.
Sherri, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here with you, Ash.
You've been working in the United States Department of Defense since 1983, focusing on climate change and the impacts of climate change from a national security perspective. Can you please tell us, what it was like back then, having those conversations with the Department of Defense and how that evolved and the challenges in getting to where we are today?
Well, sure. So for your listeners, let me say I started out in 1987 working on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff, where my responsibility was oversight of the U.S. nation's nuclear weapons complex. And during my time on that committee, those plants that produced the fissile materials for nuclear weapons all shut down for environment, safety, and health lapses. And I say my career went from weapons to waste. So from overseeing the production of nuclear weapons and materials for those weapons to putting in place environmental cleanup and management programs. And then that led to the next chapter of my journey into the Department of Defense in 1993, where I served for 8 years as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security at a time when we were closing military bases and cleaning up active bases, many Superfund sites. We were also working with the Russians during that era at the end of the Cold War to denuclearize that country and safely remove nuclear weapons and other contaminated materials from bases in the former Soviet Union. And we were also learning in that first year of what I call the first chapter of environmental security for the military about how to also conserve natural resources and protect endangered species on military bases so that you could still train effectively and protect endangered species, everything from the desert tortoise to the red cockaded woodpecker.
So when did climate change become or come onto the radar from that Department of, and the threats from climate change from that Department of Defense perspective or your perspective?
Well, we began learning about climate change in the 1990s, but we didn't really understand it as a national security risk until the next decade, when I convened in 2007 the first group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change. And we characterized climate change as a threat multiplier. That's the term and the title of my book, Threat Multiplier, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. And we assessed that climate change would pose a serious national risk, national security risk to fragile regions around the world, but that it would pose risks at home too. And now we see that clearly every day with the very powerful storms we've just been experiencing in the United States, Hurricane Helene, now followed by Hurricane Milton. In many of the same locations, we see the compounding and cascading risks of climate change that affect us here at home, as well as the risks we see around the world.
Could you please elaborate? You mentioned the term threat multiplier, what that means and how, rather than, and just elaborate on your understanding and share experience on what a threat multiplier is and how that impacts security.
Sure. Well, the term threat multiplier is built on the concept of a force multiplier, which is a phrase used in national security circles to talk about often a technology like stealth that can give you increased power and effectiveness for your force. So a threat multiplier is something that increases the threat. So what we're all about in national security and in military preparedness is reducing risk and reducing threats to people and to our nation. So we think of those threats often as the risk of uh, a nuclear strike or chemical or biological weapons or terrorism, or today we think about cyber. So climate change acts as a threat multiplier because it increases the risks of all of those threats occurring. And it provides the context in which we have to conduct strategic competition or defend against Russian aggression in Ukraine or the conflicts that we face in the Middle East today. In every case, it's making regions more vulnerable, more susceptible in some places to being recruited by terrorists or unable to protect life and limb, where places are inundated through strong hurricanes and typhoons, or small island nations overrun by sea level rise and loss of fresh water. So in many places around the world now, we see these risks of climate change exacerbating the security situation. And it's all about stability. So, in security, we're always trying to enhance and improve stability, but now we have an unstable natural system. It's been disrupted by climate change. And so temperatures are hotter and seas are higher, and sea ice is retreating in the Arctic, and droughts are much more prolonged, and wildfires know no season. And all of those climate threat multipliers add to the instability that we face around the world.
And back to the conference with the generals in the mid 2000s, what was their response initially when suddenly they had climate change as a new threat that they possibly hadn't thought of before? And how did they take to that and start to link that into their national security planning?
So, many of them started out as skeptics. They thought, okay, climate change, that's for environmentalists or that's for tree huggers, and we're warfighters. On the other hand, you know, military leaders and military in general are trained to make decisions based on the evidence and based on the science. So they looked at that evidence. We spent a year with the nation's leading climate scientists in the UK and in the US, and with national security and intelligence professionals. And then they could see that those risks of warming temperatures, um, retreating sea ice, prolonged drought, sea level rise, storm surge, flooding, all of those risks were going to have security implications. Each person had their own aha moment where they realized, oh, wow, my forces are going to be deployed more frequently now for humanitarian assistance in natural disasters in the Pacific, for example, in response to increased intensity of and frequency of typhoons, or others could see that protecting the military base infrastructure in the US was going to be challenged by sea level rise at our coastal naval bases from Norfolk to San Diego to Hawaii. So every person has their own aha moment based on how they experience it, what their mission is. And I'd say for your listeners, every person has their own, they experience it differently depending on where you live, what your occupation is, what your family and life story is. But nonetheless, everyone is affected in some way.
It's a much less direct threat. We think of, say, the Russians invading Ukraine. It's a very linear thought process in terms of there's an aggressor, there's a war, we need to respond. And the the way that climate change leads to geopolitical instability and then can then lead to violence is a much less of a direct path. So are there any examples where you can talk about where climate change has been a contributing factor or a multiplying factor in terms of the conflicts that we've been dealing with over the last 20 years?
Well, what you see is you have both rapid and slow onset events from climate change. Storms and typhoons are rapid onset events, and the disruption that can occur in societies, particularly in vulnerable societies across much of Southeast Asia, um, has been happening already for a number of years. We've been fortunate that in most cases, we've been able to, either the indigenous forces or sometimes assisted by the US, but increasingly, even China is offering climate assistance to vulnerable Pacific Island nations. So this is, uh, this is a reality that we face today. And in the Arctic, where temperatures are rising 4 times the global average, and we have retreating sea ice, rising temperatures, and thawing and collapsing permafrost, we have a whole new ocean that has opened in our lifetimes. And now a region that had been historically characterized by cooperation is increasingly about competition, as Putin eyes the northern sea route that hugs the shallow Russian coastline as a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. And meanwhile, China sees those future shorter shipping lanes that it might be able to use, uh, both to extract energy, minerals, shipping, and in the future, even fish. So we see tensions rising, particularly around competition for fishing, as fishing grounds are depleted around the world and fish move poleward, uh, in both to the Arctic and towards Antarctica. Uh, and then we see increasingly in the Western Hemisphere in Latin America, we see regions that are drying out from prolonged drought in Central and Latin America. And then they're racked by successive hurricanes. So you have compounding risks, you have drought, then you have storms, and in areas that are mostly agricultural. And then you have, in some cases, for example, as you know, working in the food and agriculture sector, the coffee rust, the rust that has decimated the coffee crop. And so livelihoods um, are not able to be supported. And then whole communities become subject to narco traffickers, eco traffickers, human traffickers, and people are on the move to find safer ground in various areas. And then, oh, by the way, you've got the problem in Venezuela. So you've got people fleeing that into the Darien Gap. So regions that, you've got a set of compounding risks here where people are fleeing political instability, and then into regions that are no longer resilient to support the kind of population influx they are receiving.
So you've got a very broad array of threats and things going on there, and some of that will be directly related to the mandates of defense forces, but many of the issues will need collaboration between international bodies, diplomatic, humanitarian, to actually mitigate or prevent or help these people that are suffering from these different climate related threats. How do you balance all that up, and how does the DoD see that their changing role in this?
Well, Ash, you're very right that it requires a whole of government and really an international uh, response. The military is not going to solve the climate challenge in many countries around the world. It can be part of a team effort, but it needs to be led by diplomacy and development and smart climate finance solutions and development solutions from international institutions, to multilateral development banks, to um, private, public-private solutions. I mean, has to be a broad societal response to enable whole regions to become more resilient, uh, and and so there's a small supporting role, I think, for militaries to play either in securing or supporting our diplomatic and our development forces. But you're absolutely right. This is not the lead responsibility for the military.
There's a couple of things that come to mind, just from my experience, where the military has been involved in humanitarian or development work. over the last 20 years. After the 2010 earthquake, I was in Haiti and the Red Cross was doing emergency food distributions. And because of the long history of political instability and gangs, etc., the gangs would frequently hijack or attack the distribution centers and try and get all the food. And frequently, the only way you could get stability was to have the US military presence there whilst the food distribution was going on so that it could actually get to the people in need, which is not necessarily the way that humanitarian organizations like to work or would want to work, and it's possibly not necessarily how the military sees their role either, but it's this kind of marriage of convenience or necessity because of the situation. So, and the other example is the provincial reconstruction teams or PRTs that were part of the Afghanistan campaign, where military took on much more of a development role than they had previously done. How do you see, is that a role that you see as being a more common or more frequent change to the way militaries are going to be used, or the US military is going to be used? And how is that viewed as part of this challenge?
Well, let's unpack that a little bit, Ash. I think when you have an immediate crisis, and uh, human lives are at stake, the military is often that 911 force, either to back up our emergency first responders here at home, or in a deadly crisis that could occur in places like Haiti, or let's say in response to some years, in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, Indonesia, to provide immediate assistance for search and rescue and to provide humanitarian assistance and natural disaster relief. So I think that has historically been an important role uh, of the military, and that also helps to strengthen our alliances with our key allies and partners around the world. Now, in terms of building that long-term resilience in societies that are being destabilized from a variety of threats, from fragile governance to prolonged climate risks, those, that's more properly the role of development and diplomacy. And of course, as you noted, sometimes you need security forces just to provide the basic level of being able to provide that assistance where needed, so you can have a secure landscape in which to do that development and diplomacy assistance. It's a very complex world today, and as you noted, these threats aren't linear, and the response isn't linear itself. Nonetheless, I think we need to think of these long-term solutions as ones that really come out of the civilian and the commercial sector, where you're using the military as primarily the backstop, and also to provide that general level of security for a more sustainable development and to enable what has become this field of environmental peace building we see around the world now, in many cases that are where water and food sources have been depleted and become under threat. Many of the solutions being developed at the local level are led by groups understanding, civilian and NGO and other organizations who understand those long-term environmental threats. In fact, I received a Lifetime Achievement Award earlier this year from the Environmental Peace Building Association. And, that story is interesting for someone like me who spent my life in the national security and really defense fields, because a lot of it has been about providing that basis for building the peace around the world so that we can have more secure societies that can thrive at all levels.
Well, firstly, congratulations on that award, and that's wonderful to hear. And that I was speaking to someone from the Environmental Defence Fund not so long ago, and she mentioned that increasingly we're getting more and more what she termed as unusual bedfellows jumping in together. Are there any particular examples of where there's been people who would not normally, jump in the same program or work together because of this threat, collaborating and working together from your perspective?
Well, going back to my various earliest days in the Department of Defense in the 1990s, I opened the doors of the Pentagon to a lot of the environmental critics we had at the day. Uh, Groups from the Environmental Defense Fund, the Natural Resources Defense Council, to others, and I said, "Come in and talk to us. Tell us what your complaints are, because that's the only way we're going to be able to address them is by having the conversations." And we did, and then we reformed how we cleaned up our military bases and how we protected natural resources and endangered species on those same military bases, which are in many ways islands of nature. So by having that conversation and creating that trust, we often say in national security and military, you can't surge trust. You have to build those relationships in advance. And that's why our allies and partners are so important around the world. Today we find in places like today ravaged parts of the Middle East. There's an organization called EcoPeace that for a decade or for more than a decade, 2 decades almost, has been working with Palestinian, Israeli, and Jordanian leadership to provide more secure and safe water and energy solutions across those three entities. And has provided a basis for environmental and climate peace building in that region. Now, of course, it's hard to undertake that in the context of the current war and the conflict that's going on, but they have been central to helping to build some of the longer term tenets of water and energy security that will enable better solutions the day after.
You've mentioned water and energy, and they're both vitally important. Where do you see food coming into this? And I guess a second part of that is the impact that Russia has had on limiting, or has at various stage of limiting, exports of wheat, etc., from Ukraine, shows also a growing willingness to weaponize food by, some actors.
Yes, very, very true. Russia has weaponized not only energy but food in its aggression against Ukraine. I actually wrote a piece a number of years ago uh, uh, in the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs about Russia potentially weaponizing food in Ukraine. And at the time, I remember when the article went up, the Russian embassy said, "Oh, we would never do that." In response to the speech, of course, they did just exactly that in Ukraine, and that really, I think, has opened many people's eyes to the threat of weaponizing food, because Ukraine has been such an important exporter of wheat on the global market, and we've seen now an increasing intersection between uh, food and agricultural and kind of climate and security in general. We have a whole project at the Center for Climate Security, of which I'm a part, about feeding resilience and what we need to do to improve food security globally, and that we need to understand that as part of a broader basis of human and global security as we think about how we're going to have secure communities in the future. We have to provide for that agricultural resilience, everything from understanding topsoil and soil erosion to understanding water and improved forms of irrigation. And there are many technologies and there are many opportunities to innovate. They just have to get to the right people in the right places at the right time. And so you have to have the right level of security in the region, and then be able to have that innovation and have the right people in the community. Often I will say that it's empowering the women and girls to be more active in setting the basis for food and water security in their local community that provides that modicum of stability for people to thrive. I've seen that with my own eyes when I've been in parts of the Middle East and parts of Africa, that just enabling the women and girls to be more central to making those decisions allows for greater security and long-term stability in the region.
And in many ways, those kind of it's almost like a crack that once the crack starts, you can't just close it. It expands and it leads to other cracks. And and I guess when you look, especially across that band around the Sahel, there's been, people have referred to it as the coup band of Africa, where there's been more coups than anywhere else in the world in recent years. And also on that note, I was speaking to the National Red Cross not so long ago, and they were saying that 60% or around 60% of the countries most impacted by climate change are also impacted by conflict. So you see, there's a correlation there. In terms of actually making real on the ground progress or impact, given the nature of many of those countries, the lack of governance they have, the potential poor infrastructure in terms of roads and any cultural divisions. How do that's a big job. Where do you start that whole process?
That is a big challenge, and many of these countries across Middle East and North Africa, from Somalia to Mali and Niger, have just exploding population rates, fragile governance, and then, as we say, climate change makes them a petri dish for terrorism. And so increasingly people are recruited when there's inadequate food and water sources, and pastoralists and farmers and herders can no longer live peaceably in the same region. And then people start to move to find better sources of food and water. And then the young male youth often get recruited by the ISIS and Al-Qaeda offshoots. So these require a set of integrated solutions to address. And some of it is being able to provide better sources of local agriculture and food security. Some of it is by being able to provide better sources of infrastructure. Unfortunately, we've seen in many of these regions either the Wagner Group or Chinese entrance into the providing sort of almost false hope solutions. We'll build you a road, we'll build you a port, but then, of course, it doesn't come with adequate jobs, it doesn't come with security, and then often countries are left in a debt trap. So, the U.S. and other allied nations and partners are working on, let's say, on the India Middle East economic corridor, which is a set of integrated solutions that provide both infrastructure and food and water security. These things unfortunately don't happen overnight, and there's a lot of tensions in the region, but that is a basis in many ways of thinking through these long-term solutions that provide an understanding of what it takes to be resilient as a society. And as you say, it's both food, water, energy, and also economic empowerment for women and girls, because that also changes over the long term what the birth rates are, and then enables the society to be more sustainable.
And back to the military and the DoD. That's how did they prepare or change the way they prepare for this? Because some of that security is going to be by providing potential training for local security forces. Plus, there's the asymmetric warfare that will come out of fighting terrorist organizations. Plus, there's the old school big power competition, fighting our big rivals or against our big rivals like Russia. So you've got these multiple levels of threat, which they're much more complex than, say, what the generals were looking at, during the First and Second World War, where it was a more nation against nation.
Well, in the U.S. Department of Defense today, and across many of our NATO allies, there are efforts now to have climate literacy within our military forces. And that means understanding, having climate relevant education and training at various echelons and levels of command. Not everybody needs the same thing. If you're equipment operator, we used to say, a tank is an oil spill waiting to happen. So if you're driving a tank, okay, you got to understand how you're going to be able to make it, manage it in today's environment so that it's both efficient and effective. And as we know, in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, many of our military convoys trucking fuel to the front were putting our soldiers and Marines at risk from improvised explosive device attacks. Now we're thinking about different ways to power our forces at the front, everything from hybrid vehicles that are both quieter and have better torque, to renewables for remotely powered installations at the front. So that's one dimension of it. How do we make our forces lighter, more agile, and effective in a contested logistics environment? So that's on the, now troops also have to deploy in hotter and colder temperatures, hotter in parts of the equatorial regions, more subject to Black Flag days. So what does a soldier or Marine need to know if they're going to deploy, and how do they protect themselves from infectious disease and also from heat stroke? And then how do you more sustainably get water and energy and food even, in these local areas? There's new technologies to enable us to capture water, so you don't have to truck in large volumes of water in plastic bottles, which then creates more waste. So, and that's at the sort of operational tactical level. At the geostrategic level, in every region of the world, we're now doing climate war games to understand how climate threats, increased storm intensity combined with a cyber attack, might be a disruptive event in a future Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific, or how storm intensity is undermining resilience in parts of Latin America and across Africa. So at every level of command in every region, sort of there's different sets of climate-informed decision-making. Climate-informed decision-making is what the goal is here. And some of that, Ash, is also about improving our predictive capabilities so that we can move from the weather forecast we have today, reliable out for, maybe a week, but with increasing storm and disruptive intensity, we need to have short-term climate forecasts that are also reliable for planning purposes. Every sector of society needs that. Farmers need that so they can know what crops to plant next year, next season, and understand how changes in precipitation and changes in soil moisture might affect what they plant. Military planners need climate-informed decision-making so they can understand how a potential deployment next season is going to be affected by storm surge or sea level rise or drought conditions. So this closing this, what we say, the 1 to 10 year gap in short-term climate prediction is increasingly a very important sector of having climate knowledge. We call it climate intelligence or precision climate prediction, so that we can make decisions based on accurate information, understanding that we can't rely on weather and climate of the past to predict the future, because climate change is now accelerating at such a rapid rate.
The military has done a huge amount of work in this space, from everything you just said, including ensuring that everyone has at least a basic climate literacy, to changing the way you predict weather and other events. What can other sectors, be that government or the private sector or civil society, learn from the military's or DoD's experience in this space to accelerate their own progress?
Well, a lot of this innovation is happening in the private sector. It's coming out of Silicon Valley, companies, but not only in California, I mean around the country and around the world. Even let's say the European Copernicus uh, climate system provides a set of climate services across all sectors of society so that you can have better informed planning. So I think this is really today an integrated civil military undertaking. I mean, we have a lot of technologies that spin into the military, not just historically. Innovations came out of defense research and development, from the internet to GPS. But today, a lot of the innovations actually occur, in the private sector, and they spin into the military, and then they are adapted for military needs. And so the important thing today is to be connected, as we are, to those innovations occurring in energy and climate tech in the civilian sector, and then be able to bring them in and adapt them for security and military purposes by being, for example, in energy, the military is now rapidly deploying microgrids at military bases in order to have energy security, because we have a fragile national electric grid. And so if the power goes down out in a storm, or if the power goes out because of a deliberate or a cyber attack, you want to be able to keep your base has to continue to operate. And so to have that secure power, if you have a microgrid, then you can island your base and enable you to operate. And sometimes those microgrids now allow for renewable energy sources, or at the first net zero military base that we have in the US in Albany, Georgia, they have a waste to energy plant, sort of capturing methane from an old landfill and using that as one of the energy sources. And so as you move to more distributed energy sources with microgrids, that's an example both of energy security and energy resilience, but then also using, in this case, the buying power of the military will help make that market for microgrids, where we'll see more of those deployed, I think, in communities around the nation, so that when we have these more intense storms, you have more pockets of power, let's say pockets of power. And if the big grid goes down, you not only have your generator at your home or at your building, but you have a wider net of power from a microgrid that can come back online faster than, for example, the larger grid.
So that's a local resilience, I guess. So you're not reliant on, it's not having your supply lines too long in many ways, which is, something that Napoleon suffered, I guess, back in the day when he tried to take on Russia and it was all a bit too far away. You have recently had a book published, Threat Multiplier. Can you tell us a bit about the book and what motivated you to write it?
Well, thank you, Ash. Well, I've been telling you about the book as we've been having this conversation. The story of Threat Multiplier and the book is the story of the military's environmental and climate awakening over the last 30 years, both as I've lived it and as the stories of other military leaders on the front lines of a changing climate as it's been experienced around the world, and here at home in the United States. And so I wrote the book because I wanted to tell that story. It's a story of many, but it's an untold story often. People think, what does climate change have to do with the military? And now we see that the military has been on the front lines of a changing climate, and has recognized it as a security threat now, for almost several decades. And then I wanted to tell the story of the unsung heroes in the military and the other national security professionals whose stories aren't often told, but who have been working, as I have, to understand the challenges and to ensure that we can protect America from all manner of threats.
Are there any of those stories from one of those unsung heroes that you'd like to share?
I will tell you most vividly the story of Admiral Jamie Fogo, who, as a young submariner, went up to the Arctic with his submarine and they do something called an ice pick maneuver, and they pop out on the ice, and then the sailors from the submarine get to go out, and they get to see, be on the ice. They might get a don a Santa suit or play some baseball, take some pictures, and send it back home to the families because they're down in the bowels of the submarine, for months on end. And then he goes back about 20 years later. Now he's in command of the submarine, and Admiral Fogel goes back and he tries to do the ice pick maneuver, and when he reaches approximately the same location, he can't surface the same way because there's not enough ice anymore. And it's blue water. And when he gets up there, he sees blue water and plastic waste. So that's how he experienced, a uh, changing Arctic. General Tom Middendorf, who was a former uh, chief of staff of the Dutch military and is my co-chair on the International Military Council on Climate Security, had many deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan and parts of the Middle East and North Africa, and found that in certain cases in a village in Afghanistan, where after securing the region and trying to defend against the Taliban forces, but also found that the community in this town of Chora was highly water depleted, that by being able to work with local village leaders to provide better water sources and resolve some conflicts over water, that enabled some modicum of security and less vulnerability to Taliban encroachment. Now, was that a long-term solution? No. But of course, that provides some temporary relief. And so we see that when water issues can be resolved, you have better security. And we've seen that now in regions across, in communities across the Middle East, North Africa, parts of Latin America, elsewhere, that without water security, you can't have stability.
Thank you very much for that. I think that what's been alluded to there as well is that, military personnel frequently get to go to parts of the world that the general population don't get to go to. So there's amazing resource in terms of eyes and ears and senses, like the admiral in the Arctic, or like someone who's spending time in Afghanistan, that gets a perspective that many other people working on climate aren't able to obtain because they don't go to those places.
Well, you're absolutely right. And so they bring that experience back home and help us inform how we need to make our societies better.
Before we go, is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't previously discussed?
Well, Ash, I hope very much that understanding of how climate acts as a threat multiplier can also lead people to understand that there are opportunities, the opportunity multiplier, to improve and move towards more what I talk about in the book, and tell the story of mutually assured resilience. That we really need to move now as we build resilient communities, both here at home in the wake of the storms that we've experienced, and understand that it's important to have resilience in our infrastructure, in our societies, in our energy systems and our water systems. That we also need resilience in communities around the world, because we won't have global security unless we have security in other regions of the world. In the Cold War, we talked about MAD, mutually assured destruction, that by the United States and the Soviet Union both being able to annihilate each other with nuclear weapons, that provided some level of stability. Okay. Well, to have stability in the climate era, we need mutually assured resilience, or some call it collective resilience. And I think we're moving towards this concept of collective resilience, where food, water, and energy security at the local level are an essential component of having global security.
Sherri, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ash. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Sherri Goodman. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the Ash Cloud, where I will continue to discuss food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the political, environmental, and cultural challenges facing our societies and creative ideas on how to address them.